Member from Newmarket, Aurora.
My question is to the Premier. Speaker, on Monday I asked the Premier why he and his cabinet sold out Ontario's air ambulance service to Dr. Chris Mazza for $1 against the advice of senior civil servants and legal advice from the Attorney General. The Premier refused to answer, as he has refused to answer most questions about the Ornge Scandal over the last number of months. Speaker, given the warnings about potential financial abuse and risk to patients, and seeing that we're now reaping the results of that wrong decision, I believe the people of this province deserve to hear from the Premier as to why he and his cabinet approved that faulty proposal by Dr. Mazza.
Premier.
Speaker, the Minister of Community and Social Services.
House Leader.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member is aware that this is a matter which is right now before the Public Accounts Committee. And, Mr. Speaker, every member of this House would acknowledge that there were problems with Ornge. That is why the Minister of Health took fast action when she was alerted to those problems. She took a number of measures in terms of a new administration at Ornge, forensic auditors that came in. Unfortunately, the Ontario Provincial Police had to be called in. But the most important thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we have a piece of legislation before this legislature, Bill 50. And I think the honourable member owes it to the people of Ontario to tell them why he is blocking an important piece of legislation which would strengthen Ornge and address many of the concerns that he raises.
Thank you. It's starting. Question gets asked.
Speaker, I think what's owed the people of this province is a response from the Premier, who ultimately is responsible for the decisions that are made in this government. And seeing as the Premier is not willing to respond
come to order.
in this House, and seeing as his government House Leader continues to tell us that these proceedings should be conducted in the Public Accounts Committee, Speaker, I want to put the Premier on notice that I will be putting a motion forward at the Public Accounts Committee to call the Premier to come and testify at the committee.
Be seated, please. Be seated, please. Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member insists upon holding hearings on the floor of the legislature, well then let's get into it, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk about what happened at the Oshawa airport. Let's talk about the fact that 2 weeks ago.
I will now do two things. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, two weeks ago, a former Ornge executive, a senior aviation expert, said he had opposed the move to to Oshawa Airport. Despite that, Mr. Speaker, we know that the member for Whitby, Oshawa, not only lobbied to get a base in her riding,
member from Northumberland, Quinte West, come to order.
In her orange helicopter. We know that the member from Durham also lobbied.
Member from Renfrew, come to order. Answer. Thank you.
Speaker, the government House Leader tells us not to conduct the hearings here. I'm willing to comply with that. And that's why we'll be putting forward a motion to call the Premier to the Public Accounts Committee so that we can hear from him once and for all, without the interruption and the rhetoric from his government House Leader. We want to know from the Premier, why did he and his cabinet approve this proposal by Dr. Mazza against the recommendation of senior civil servants, and we have the mess on our hands today. The public deserves to know from this Premier.
Thank you. Government House Leader. Be seated, please. Be seated, please. Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'll continue the story of the Oshawa Airport and Ornge. Mr. Speaker, members may want to review the Toronto Star this morning. 3 emails obtained by the Star imply that one Jim Flaherty,
The member for Peterborough come to order.
was interested in where Ornge was going.
The member from Huron-Bruce come to order.
I quote, Mr. Speaker, the first email dated Saturday, June 11th, and sent to Ornge staffer, sent by Ornge staffer Matthew.
The member from the Fian Carleton come to order.
Government relations.
Answer.
And the former Tory staffer said Jim Flaherty is eagerly waiting a decision on whether or not we'll be going to Oshawa.
New question, Newmarket Aurora.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, I have a very simple question to the Premier.
He won't ask it. He won't answer it.
And I want to make this as simple as possible. All I really would like is either yes or no. Will the Premier agree to come to the Public Accounts Committee to answer questions on this important issue, because the people of this province are waiting to hear from the man himself who's responsible for the decisions that were made to give air ambulance service in Ontario to Dr. Chris Mazza.
Premier.
Speaker, I'm delighted to speak to the question. And let me say, Speaker, that we've spent a considerable amount of time and devoted a lot of energy and committee time, and appropriately so, to addressing this issue. But I think it's important to distinguish between the perspective held by my honourable colleague opposite and ours on this side of the House. I would suggest that a confused public might pay attention to objective, dispassionate, arm's-length, non-partisan, reliable officials in this matter. That's why we had the auditor take a look at this, Speaker. And I think it's important that we rely on his observations and his recommendations. We've also, Speaker, invited the Ontario Provincial Police in to conduct their own investigation, and I think we should await the outcome of that investigation again, Speaker. I think that's the appropriate thing to do.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Well, Speaker, I guess I didn't make it simple enough. We have a very straightforward question for the Premier. If he's been watching the proceedings of the committee, we're hearing a great deal of information
Minister of the Environment, come to order.
about decisions that were made to entrust Ontario's air ambulance service to people who were not competent to carry out that program. We heard that again today.
The member from Eglinton Lawrence,
So we would
come to
like
order.
to know from the Premier, given that he has refused to answer direct questions here, will he agree to come before the Public Accounts Committee in response to a motion that I will be filing to call him to that committee?
Premier.
Again, Speaker, I'll say it again and a little bit more directly. My honourable colleague's interest in this is purely partisan. We have a responsibility in government to uphold the public interest. And again, I say to the public, I think we can and should rely on the auditor's report. I think we can and should rely on the investigation being conducted by the Ontario Provincial Police, Speaker. And I think we can and should rely on some of the measures that we've already put in place. We have replaced the leadership at Ornge, Speaker. We have put in place a new performance agreement so that we can lend better direction, bring more transparency and more oversight to bear. We also have a bill on the floor of this House, Speaker, which objectively will improve our ability to ensure we get the very best out of Ornge from a variety of different perspectives, Speaker. Again, I say to my honourable colleague, if his interest is truly the public interest, then let's move forward with the bill that's already on this House.
New question. The member from Nickel Belt.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma question est également